Hi everyone, my name is Stephanie Willis. I am a literacy and media specialist in Northern New Jersey. Welcome to my channel. If you're new here, thanks for stopping by. If you have been here before, welcome to the third episode of the Read-Aloud Party. The Read-Aloud Party is a series that I just started to share some of the picture books that I absolutely love and how I am using them in my classroom with my students, and also ways that you can use them with your children at home. I also run an Instagram account called At the Literacy Party, where I share book recommendations and ways that I use those books in my classroom. So Read-Aloud Party is kind of just an extension of that, and it gives you a little bit more information. So thank you so much for being here. On today's episode, I'm going to share with you 4 books and how I am using them in a fake news unit that I created for my students. With the election going on late last year, and all the media that we are consuming, it really felt like a necessary thing for me to work with my 4th and 5th grade students on, a unit of fake news and just looking for, credible sources, really diving into like fact versus opinion, perspective bias, and as I mentioned, really analyzing and evaluating the sources that you're using and looking at for information. So with that being said, I created a unit and I used these 4 books. I used The Nantucket Sea Monster, written by Darcy Pattinson and illustrated by Peter Willis. I used Facts versus Opinions versus Robots with my students by Michael Rex. Chicken Little, The Real and Totally True Tale by Sam Wiedlich. And also The Two Truths and a Lie It's a Live series by Amy Joan Paquette and Lori Ann Thompson. So these 4 books guided my students throughout this unit, in addition to some other activities I created that's available in my fake news unit. I will be sharing information about these books, but also discussing how I created this unit and the other opportunities you have for teaching with your children. This I'm going to link below so that you can take a look at if it's something you think would fit in your classroom. I also created a freebie. It is a guide to this series, the Read-Aloud Party, for this segment of the Read-Aloud Party. It will allow you to take notes on all of the books that I am sharing with you today and kind of write out some ideas that you have or ideas that I share as well, and just kind of like a free note-taking guide. So it's also linked below. Okay, so the first book that I am going to start off with today is The Nantucket Sea Monster. This was the book that I used to introduce this unit on fake news with my students. So it's actually called The Nantucket Sea Monster, a Fake News Story. I'm going to kind of share with you a little bit of background around this story, and then I will share with you some of my favorite parts and how this was used in my classroom. Some of you may be familiar with the story Balloons Over Broadway, written and illustrated by Melissa Sweet. It's the story of the balloons for the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. It's a fabulous book if you haven't read it yet. It's a fantastic biography of a man named Tony Sarg, but also the story and the history of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. It's a huge hit with my students every year. So that book, as I mentioned, is written about the balloons over Broadway that float over Broadway. There is a connection to this, and it also includes Tony Sarg. So this is called Nantucket Sea Monster, a Fake News Story. And I'm going to read the back to you. It says, The Nantucket Sea Monster, a Fake News Story. Do you believe everything you read in the newspaper? Early in August 1937, a news flash came in. A sea monster had been spotted lurking off the shore of Nantucket Island. Historically, the Massachusetts island had served as port for whaling ships. Eyewitnesses swore this wasn't a whale, but some new, fearsome creature. As eyewitness accounts piled up, newspaper stories of the sea monster spread quickly across the nation, and people shivered in fear. So this nonfiction picture book is a perfect start for discussions about non-political fake news stories and free press. So basically what happened in this story is Tony Sarg took one of those beautiful balloons that he created or had for the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade and floated it off of the coast of Nantucket. Many people saw this great, large sea monster looking balloon and thought that a real sea monster was coming to take over their town and create a huge problem for them. So Tony Sarg and the Nantucket newspapers, who were in on it together, decided to run a story in the newspaper that would draw publicity for the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. But that news that broke in Nantucket created complete pandemonium. So people were running all over town, saying, it's a killer, just a whale, it's just a bunch of porpoises, it's just wreckage. So people were conflicted, but also, there were people screaming sea monster around the town. It was all over the newspapers. The news traveled all the way from Nantucket to California, and the whole reason was to build publicity. So I shared this with my students so that they knew that there are motives behind everyone's story, that you really have to be diligent in checking your sources and, identifying factual information versus opinion, people's different perspectives, why people might have bias. So we started off with this book. They loved the story. It was a great way to start off. It got them so interested in fake news in a really child-friendly but historically accurate way. Historically accurate of a fake news story, which is kind of an oxymoron, but funny. So that was the way that I introduced the unit. Okay, so that leads us to my second book that I used in this unit called Facts versus Opinions versus Robot. It's written by Michael Rex. I chose this story after reading The Sea Monster just so that I could really clarify facts versus opinions, so they knew the difference between the two, but also that they knew the language that's associated with both of those, either facts or opinions. That there's oftentimes language that will support an opinion and kind of show you that it's, opinion versus a factual statement. So this is a really great book. It has you go back and forth between, or it defines fact, it defines opinion, and then it's interactive in the sense that it asks you questions based on the pictures. Either say, is that a fact or is that an opinion? Or, what is an opinion you could say about this page versus, what is a fact that you could say about this page? So I'll just show you a few pages in this book. My students really like this. It was just kind of fun. So yeah, it has you talking about true and false. It also talks about how sometimes there's conflict when people have a difference of opinion. So it gets into that too, which leads nicely into some of the other activities that we have here. It's talking about how, sometimes you might need to really analyze your information or wait for more information before you can make a call on whether something is a fact or an opinion. So it's a really, really, really great book that you can share with your students. So after, here's a lesson plan for that lesson. And then after I had my students listen to statements from a fake news article that I had written and differentiate between whether it was a fact or an opinion. But I gave them this word bank here that, has opinion words. So words that evoke feelings, emotions, or attitudes. And I also included some phrases down below too that, might be used when you're saying an opinion. So there's a quick article here that it's just statements from an article about school uniforms. And the students had to go through and figure out whether it was a fact or an opinion. So one of the first ones is the uniforms will be worn by students in grades kindergarten through 5th grade. And we talked, is that a fact or is that an opinion based on how it's written? And we decided that that's a factual statement for this article. The next one says, the uniforms are loose and uncomfortable. We talked about how some people will be able to think one way and some might think another way, so that would have to be an opinion. So they went through and identified each. Okay, so the next lesson in this unit is actually doesn't have a book to go along with it, but it's about perspective. So we reviewed perspective as a class, and then what I did is I gave them a scenario for a town pool. And all of these people come together at a town meeting, and they voice their own perspective on the possibility of a town pool entering or being put in their community. So you have one woman named Jackie, who's a mother of 3, and doesn't want a pool because people might fool around after hours at the pool, and she doesn't want her children having any bad influences in the neighborhood. Alan is a senior citizen who lives in the neighborhood. Alan is worried about the construction as it will be an eyesore, and he's also worried about the construction, that during the construction there's going to be a lot of noise, and additional mischief might occur in the neighborhood during construction, but also with the addition of the pool. We have Kate, who is a single mother of 2 middle school age children. She's super jazzed about the pool because then while she's working during the day, her kids can go off to the pool. There'll be lifeguards. They'll be, supervised. And she's just so happy that there will be something for her children to do when she is not able to be with them. Antonio is the owner of a pizza place right next door. He's super excited about the pool as well. He's already thought up, his poolside pizza menu and how beneficial it will be for his business to have a town pool nearby. And the last perspective that my students read was about Bob, who owns Bob's Pools. Bob's company was reached out to. He would be the builder for this town pool. It would be, his first really large commercial project, and it would be really great for business, not only from that project, but for future projects as well. So you can start to see how everyone whose perspective I shared with you have different ideas and motives for how they feel about this town pool. So the children read the perspectives, and then they presented their perspectives as those people. And we kind of did like a mini respectful debate. And we talked about, how does a character's personal experiences affect his or her perspective in general? And also in general, how one's perspective or difference of opinion can lead to conflict. So that was a really awesome activity that we did as well. Okay, lesson number 4. Also doesn't have a book, so but it's about bias. So in this lesson about bias, we looked at 2 articles on the same topic. Both of them were about zoos. So one was about how zoos save endangered animals. It's available on Newsella. I will link it below. And the other was about how zoos are, treat animals poorly, and it's not their natural habitat, and that they should be banned. So we presented both articles to my class, and they read both of them and had to talk about whether there was bias in those articles. Are they presenting only one perspective? So they also filled out this little news article analysis where they write the title, the author of the article, and then I wanted them to look at the article for facts and opinions. So I asked them to give a few examples of facts that they found in the article, but then also examples of opinion statements in the article. And then I wanted them to write, what they thought the author's perspective was, and then did they believe the article was biased? Yes or no, and write why or why not. So that was a really awesome lesson that my students did as well. And it was interesting because I also posted them in the beginning, like, what are your thoughts about zoos? And they also, even just going into these articles, have their own bias. So having a bias going into the way that you read a story about a certain perspective can also be an interesting thing to do as well. Okay. Our next lesson in this unit was about credible sources. So I read the story Chicken Little, The Real and Totally True Tale. It's a really adorable book by Sam Wiedlich, and it goes on and on about, Chicken Little getting hit in the head and how, he's trying to figure out whether the sky is falling. And someone's like, oh, Chicken Little, what are you doing? And he goes, I'm trying to figure out if the sky is falling. And then, off runs that chicken and tells the entire group of hens and other chickens that the sky is falling. And it creates complete pandemonium, or in this book, hendemonium. But what Chicken Little does is Chicken Little goes directly to the sky and says, "Hey, sky, are you falling?" And the sky is like, that's impossible. I have gravity. I it's impossible. I do not fall. So, Chicken Little is trying to like convince everybody that, the sky is not falling. I talked to the sky himself, and, this isn't happening. And, no one's believing it. But what they're doing is they're running into other problems. So they all want to like leave the coop and run out into the wild when there's actual predators and really bad things that could harm them out there. So it's just like an interesting perspective. But, it shows that Chicken Little went directly to a credible source for information. And that's what we talked about with my students. So, to introduce credible sources. After I read that story, we talked about ways to decide whether a source is credible or not. We talked about whether the author is an expert in the field. When was the source published? Is it up to date? Is the purpose of the source to inform? Or is it to persuade or sell? Because if it is, then we might not have a very credible source on our hands. Is the provided information more factual rather than opinion-based? So are the statements, that we've learned how to differentiate between earlier on, factual or opinion-based? And then is your source from a .org, .gov, or .edu website? Those are the guidelines that I use with my students in order to decide whether a source is credible or not. After we discussed, Chicken Little went directly to the source, we're going to talk about, credible sources. I had my students evaluate the the articles from the previous week, the 2 articles on zoos. So, one was an opinion piece written by a child in 6th grade. And it's like, is that person a credible source? Are they an expert in the field of zoology? No. Was it on, when was it published? Recently? And, my students brought up a really good point. They talked about, how much time is like up to date. So, an article published in 2015, is that relevant? And we talked about how, depending on the field, like technology, something that came out in 2015 is probably less relevant than something on zoos that came out in 2015. So it definitely depends on the industry, but that was a great conversation that we had. So they looked at the credible source from the sources from the previous week and decided whether or not those were credible based on our credible source checklist. Okay, the last lesson that we have in this unit goes along with the book Two Truths and a Lie. In this book, each chapter presents 2 truths and 1 lie. So it'll give you like 3 outrageous scenarios, and 2 of them are true and 1 of them is a lie. And what my children had to do was, they listened to each one, and then they had to use their credible source guide to find research articles to either determine whether each scenario they had was true or false. So I chose a chapter here, let me open it up, about medium-sized animals, and one of the scenarios was about an octopus living in these Pacific Northwest tree octopus. So that was one thing that they had to research with credible sources. The next one was about a chicken living with its head cut off for more than 24 hours. And that was another scenario they had to research. And last was these tiny dragons that live deep, deep, deep under the water that are still around today. So 3 pretty fascinating ideas, and my students used kid-friendly search engines, which I have listed here, to research the 3 scenarios. This is also included in the unit I created, but I also have a guide in here. So it gives them a place to paraphrase each of the 3 scenarios, and then a spot for research notes on each. And then I wanted them to go back and circle the one that's circle the ones that are truths and put an X to the one that is a lie. This year during distance learning, I'm actually having my students do them in breakout groups, and I'm having each group research only one of them. So depending on how much time, you can either make these group work or, have each class, like this little research project takes a little bit of time. So, what's so great is that they have a ton of fun with this. These 4 books are excellent, and it really gives them a really good idea of fake news, but also how to be like research detectives and analyze and evaluate their sources moving forward. So I hope that you enjoyed learning about these 4 books and this unit that I created. Again, it's all linked below and available. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me through the comments below, or you can find me on my Instagram at The Literacy Party. I would love to hear from you, especially if you use this in your classroom. Thank you for watching.